hunting is conservation, right? I mean, we see the phrase online or in a magazine. Maybe we repeat that phrase to non-hunters as we try to explain what hunting is all about. But do we understand that phrase to be true? Do we understand it with nuance and granularity? Do we understand it within the context of all the dollars that go to conservation here in the United States? And could we defend that phrase when challenged? Admittedly, I was put on my heels a bit when an anti-hunter said to me, no, hunting isn't conservation. Just look at what the USDA does. Look at the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Look at the Endangered Species Act. Look at the Farm Bill when it's in effect. Look at these other non-government, non-profit organizations dedicated to conservation. So no, hunting isn't conservation. And I understand his point, and we'll talk more about that. But to be clear, the phrase hunting is conservation isn't exclusionary. It doesn't mean that it's the only form of conservation. That would be silly. It would be like me saying running is exercise, and then someone saying, no, running isn't exercise, cycling is exercise. Well, both are true. Running is exercise, and cycling and lifting weights is exercise. So to be clear, it's not an exclusionary statement. But then he shared with me a paper from Nevadans for Responsible Wildlife Management. This came out in October of 2014, written by Mark Smith and Donald Mould. This isn't peer-reviewed or anything of that nature, but what they wanted to do was they wanted to look at the broader bucket of conservation dollars, and they wanted to figure out which of those dollars came from non-hunters and which of those dollars came from hunters. And what they determined was that 93.9% of all of those dollars came from the non-hunting public, and 6.1% came from the hunting public. So let's take this a little bit further. I wonder what percentage of the U.S. were hunters back then. Well, I did a little research. 11.5 million, roughly, people in the U.S. were hunters at that time. And let's just look at that in the context of adults over the age of 18 in the U.S. at that time. That totaled 245 million people. So 11.5 million into 245 million is 4.6%. So really what Mark Smith and Donald Mould said, that 4.6% of the population contributed 6.1% of the dollars to conservation. So for that, I want to thank Mr. Smith and Mr. Mould for illustrating exactly what hunters are trying to communicate, that we care more and give more than most when it comes to conservation. So thank you. But if you dig a little deeper, if you peel back the onion a little bit, you see what Mr. Smith and Mr. Mould were really trying to do was minimize the impact that hunters have towards conservation. And you look at some of the gymnastics and twisting of numbers that they did to get to 93.9%. So we'll talk about the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act funds here on the chart. They combine those two funds, and then if you look at the far right, you can see that of that, 714 million of that 882 million were allotted to the non-hunting public. And that's really interesting because the Pittman-Robertson Act, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is an excise tax on outdoor hunting gear and equipment. But let's keep going. The Ducks Unlimited, in its DNA, is a pro-hunting, pro-conservation organization. And of the dollars that Ducks Unlimited contributes to conservation, they allocated 7 million of that to the U.S. non-hunting public. That's interesting. And then if you look at the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, very similarly, the DNA of that organization is to increase the range of elk and access to elk hunting and ground for elk to thrive, and of course conservation of those wild places. And they allocated another 3 million from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, a pro-hunting organization. So again, it's, as you can see, there's some fuzzy math going on there, and it's quite interesting. But let's go back to the statement that the anti-hunter made about the USDA, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Endangered Species Act, and the Farm Bill. And again, he was trying to minimize the impact of hunters, but where do those dollars come from for those funds and institutions, I guess? Well, they come from my federal tax dollars, your federal tax dollars, everybody's. all the taxpayers here in the United States contribute to conservation, whether they want to or not. And quite honestly, those dollars are agnostic to what you do. They're not, they don't care if you backcountry ski. They don't care if you bird watch or hike or hunt. They're really conservation dollars. And so it's a little disingenuous for anti-hunters to sort of wrap their arms around those dollars, the $437 billion budget that the USDA has, and say, yeah, that's our contribution. And let's dig a little deeper. Let's look at the attitudes of the American taxpayer. And 98% of Americans purchase meat in their household. 80% of Americans consider themselves a meat eater. And 73% of Americans approve of legal hunting. So I guess if we're going to squabble over these conservation dollars, I don't think it's fair to say that anti-hunters could sort of take ownership of that. But let's take that bucket of dollars for conservation off the table and let's dig a little deeper. Let's look at these non-hunting specific or non-government, non-profit conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy. This is one of the largest out there. And if you dig around a little bit, they don't have a positional or policy position on hunting, but they're very pro-fishing, and they do have an article or two on hunting. So they're not anti-hunting. Let's look at the World Wildlife Fund. Well, they're concerned about threatened wildlife. The Sierra Club is a big one, of course. We've all heard of that. They have a policy position that they are pro-hunting or pro-legal hunting. And now I don't agree with everything that the Sierra Club does or some of these other organizations, but most of them have no positional statement like the National Audubon Society on for or against hunting. Most of them are focused on climate change or they're focused on clean water or restoration. So again, I think it's a little disingenuous for sort of anti-hunters to claim that they're committed to conservation when none of these organizations are necessarily anti-hunting. So let's move that group off the table and let's talk more specifically about what hunters do actually do. And let's get beyond some of the anti-hunter rhetoric. So I mentioned earlier the Pittman-Robertson Act. It's also known as the Wildlife Restoration Act. What it is an excise tax on hunting gear and equipment. And this year alone, it totaled $989 million. So that $999 million was reallocated to states across the U.S. for their management, science-based management of habitat and wildlife. Now, each state has state biologists that are highly educated scientists, but science-based management to manage sometimes over 500 species of animals within their respective state. So close to $1 billion there through the Pittman-Robertson Act. This was signed into existence in 1937 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was an outdoorsman himself. Now let's look at licenses and permits. So back in 2018, I found some data. $256 million were spent on licenses and permits by outdoorsmen and women. And so those dollars go back to that respective state and help again with science-based management. So I think there's a theme here. We have dollars that the hunters and outdoorsmen and women spend and goes right back into science-based conservation efforts. But again, Mr. Smith and Mr. Mold would like to sort of divvy that up. And so what I'm going to do is say, let's pull that off the table. Let's keep going. Let's see what else hunters, outdoorsmen and women contribute to conservation beyond their tax dollars and even beyond the Pittman-Robertson Act and beyond licenses and permits. So let's start with Ducks Unlimited. In 2023, revenue and memberships and support totaled $341 million. Backcountry hunters and anglers, $6 million. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, $83 million in support and revenue. The National Wildlife Turkey Federation, $58 million. Pheasants and Quail Forever, $104 million. The Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, $9 million. And I'm not even going to mention National Deer Alliance, the Boone and Crockett Club, Pope and Young, the Mule Deer Foundation, Whitetails Unlimited, the Wild Sheep Foundation. I know I'm forgetting some others, but if we total the numbers that I just shared with you, that's over $500 million more dollars that hunters are giving of their own volition back to organizations like these that are dedicated to conservation. So if you're a hunter and you're watching this, what I'm going to ask is that you double down. Conservation matters. We love wild animals and we love wild places. And so continue to contribute to organizations like these. If you're an anti-hunter, I don't know what to tell you. It is true, hunting is conservation. I know it may be frustrating, but maybe what you should do is be a little frustrated about something else, because the burden of proof is on you now. Where are your conservation dollars? Help us understand that. Best of luck, everyone, and have a great season.